I am the immediate past president of EURISA. I'm also a product manager with Geocom, and I actually am part of the GIS Data Model version 2 working group for NINA. I'm very excited to be here today with you. And just a couple of little housekeeping notes. Again, if you could please keep yourself on mute, I would appreciate that. At the bottom of your display window, there is a chat dialog box window that will open up the chat dialog box. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you could just type them in the dialog box there, we will address those either at a time during the session that it seems appropriate to interrupt our awesome speakers, or we will answer them all at the end. And with that, if you didn't notice the pop-up, this meeting is being recorded, and you will note that when we do get started, there should be live closed captioning appearing as well. So if you want to see the closed captioning, again, on that bottom status bar, you can click on show subtitle, and that will show the closed captioning. And now I'm going to turn things over to two amazing co-chairs of the GIS Data Model Working Group, Cheryl Benjamin and Deb Roseboom.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Just to go through a quick intro, my name is Deb Roseboom. I'm a product manager with Geocom. I've been doing public safety GIS for over 17 years, from being a GIS specialist to running teams of specialists, project manager, consultant, running our West Coast office, and now as a product manager. So really focusing in on the services we provide and making sure that what we provide fits the needs and fits the market and follows the standards and everything like that. And I've had the pleasure of joining as a co-chair the data model work group. I was a member the first time around, all 8 years of that. And this time around, I'm a co-chair along with Cheryl, who is presenting with me. Cheryl, if you want to say hi.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl Benjamin. I have about probably over 33 years of GIS related experience. 30 of that was spent within the state of New York, where I ran their statewide streets and site structure address points working groups, programs that were there. I worked a little bit with the public safety community on the side, but it was really about 10 years ago where the programs were moving forward and we started partnering up with the public safety community and learning about standards. And part of that was, well, 911 files NINA standards. So we got involved in NINA standards, and somehow I got brought into a work group about site structure address points, and they convinced me unknowingly that I should co-chair this work group. And you'll be done in a year. And so 30 months later, we finally finished the document. But also when I started being involved in NINA, I also joined the GIS Data Model work group. And so I was involved since about 2011. Now, Deb has the distinction of being on that work group since the beginning, all 8 years of it. But a little bit about that work group is, as it progressed through its 8-year history, I was able to help with some of the documentation. But then as co-chairs came and went, a position opened up and they really needed to get moving forward. So we said, all right, I will help finish this up. So my involvement was mostly as a member, but the last maybe 2 years or so, I participated as a co-chair in version 1. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over where we are with version 2. And the overview that you see on the screen right now, I'm not going to go through each item, but basically the whole version 2 was focused on expanding the standard to address some issues that had come up once the document was released. So after the document was released, people started implementing it. Items were found that were not quite working well, or there were inconsistencies. And another thing that had happened is there was a work group stood up to create a GIS data template in both Esri format and also an open source Postgres version. And during that particular work group's activities, they were looking at it from an implementation perspective, and they identified numerous things that needed to be reviewed. And that's part of what happened in version 2. So some of the stuff that we looked at is, just the document structure and the way things were laid out. We wanted to go back and look at that a little bit. Also, some of the data requirements that were in there, we found a lot of inconsistencies as far as how things are being referenced, both not only with the layers, but also with some of the fields. And then there were a lot of questions about the boundaries, your service boundaries, which are your PSAP, your police, fire, and EMS, and then the big kind of gray area of this provisioning boundary. And so these are some of the things that we're going to talk to you about what we ended up doing in the document. Okay, so we're going to talk now first about the standard version 1, version 2. What is the difference between them? So first thing to note, I mentioned Deb and I were involved in version 1. And if you look at version 1 document that took 8 years to develop, there were 67 people that are listed in that document. So those were folks who probably hung out for at least a year with the work group, but we estimate there had to be at least double that for the amount of number of people over that time period who participated. Version 2 actually started in June of 2020, and we have 43 people who've been involved in that document. Not everyone's been there since the beginning, and we've had some people join us recently, and also folks who started with us. Some of them have had to leave, their job positions change and stuff, but we have a core group of folks who've been working on this. And then when you look at version 1, version 2, the key thing to note as the co-chairs that were involved now. So that's myself and Deb, and then we had Sherry Massey from Kansas initially, and now Tim Bryant from Texas is our current co-chair. We were all involved in version 1. So we're coming to version 2 with knowledge that we understand the document, the issues that were brought forward. And then we had, out of those 67 people who were on version 1, there were 16 of us who were brave enough to stick around for version 2. So there's a lot of history that we're bringing with us. Unfortunately, we don't remember everything that happened over the 8 years, but between us, we usually can figure out what was some of the stuff that we ran into that needed to be discussed.
And if we can't remember, Cheryl, you probably have a copy.
Well, yeah, that is the one thing, is I tended to be a document hog and would write things to my computer drive. So I'm able to usually pull up things that sometimes shock me too. So unlike version 1 that took 8 years, version 2, we completed our core content within 1 year. We actually met our charter goal, was finished our task work within a year. And how did we do that? Well, first of all, you have 2 project managers here who are super great taskmasters and kept things on track. And also, we were told to make sure we stay in scope. Unlike version 1, which had a very broad and not very well defined scope, so things crept all the time. We constantly running scope creep. This time we had a very definitive scope, and we stayed with it. And that scope is actually put in something called a charter. And that is the box that we were told we must play within this box, try not to go outside of it. And of course, we did go outside of it a few times, so we had to modify our charter, but we were able to pretty much stay on board with where we were. So in version 2, our goal was the items in the charter. So where do those come from? If you look at version 1 of the data model, there are 3 pages of future work that are in version 1. And that future work were things that we had to look at and determine, okay, what are we going to work on in version 2? So what we did is we sat down before the work group started with our data structures and data management co-chairs, and we laid out a multi-version proposal that said, on all this work that has to be done, how do we go through this? How do we get it done? So the first thing we did is said, okay, what's really not appropriate for the GIS data model work group? There are other MENA work groups that maybe this work belongs in, such as the data transition, the CLDXF work group, which is the civic location data exchange format work group, or the stewardship document. So those were basically taken off the table. They went to other work groups. The rest of the items that were left, we then grouped into common themes, and then we prioritized them into 6 different versions. And so we kind of had this long-term goal of how do we get through these. Now, there was in January of 2020, you may have seen a version 1.1 that went out, and that version was simply to fix Scrivener errors. The URL links were all old. They were allowed HTTP that had since transitioned to HTTPS. And there were some other minor things that did not affect the requirements that were in there that could be fixed. And the thought was, we have 8 years of stuff that we can clean up, and then we can start fresh with version 2. And so after we did that, we said, okay, let's develop our charter. So in the charter, and we had 5 main goals. Steb, if you want to move to the charter. So the things that we were told to focus on were going to be related to 2 major goals. One was creating a Canada extension so the data model could be used in Canada, and then also resolve any types of inconsistencies or issues related to road center lines. And that was laid out for us a lot by the GIS Data Model template work group. And they identified things such as there's different ways that people are referring to layer names. There's some issues with domains. The street type fields in particular, the names were inconsistently being done. And so things that they pointed out, we were asked to look at. In addition, there were some items there that the committee co-chairs asked us to look at that had to deal with atypical street naming and addressing. So what's atypical? Okay, you have that issue of like a county line road where on one side of that county line, the municipality is calling it one thing, and the folks on the other side of the county line in the different county don't like that name, so they called it something different. So how do you model that in the data model? And then what do you do about driveways and non-traversable roads? And we weren't looking at it from the perspective of what are the best practices. It was, with our data structure, does anything in the data model need to change in order to implement and deal with these items? And so we sent that first to the stewardship work group that was working on road center lines. And they debated and talked about that there first as to what potential changes might need to be sent to the GIS Data Model work group to look at and potentially implement. And so those are things that we would have to consider. The other thing that we were asked to look at is it was brought up to us that some folks felt that the right and left domain concept, the wording used to describe that, might be better improved. And so we were asked to look at that. And then lastly, we were asked to look at how the spatial reference was done. And of course, there was the datum change in 2022 that was supposed to happen. And they said, well, as long as you're looking at that, why don't you look at the horizontal and vertical accuracy? So those were the main goals that are listed in our charted. Now, while these were all discussed, not everything resulted in a change to the data model. And so we'll start talking about what some of those are. So I'll talk a little bit about what we call country neutral text. And that's basically what the Canada extension was. The entire document had to go through a review, and we wanted to make the language country neutral where possible. Now, Canada is intending to adopt this standard, and so we reached out before our work group started, and we requested folks from Canada to join our work group so that we could get through this part of the document. And I would say we had at least 20 folks from Canada, from all across Canada, that joined the work group to help us work through these particular items. And we actually set up a subgroup where they were meeting every week to talk about these things, make and determine the best practice or recommendation to move forward, to bring back to the big work group for additional discussion and decisions made. So some of the things that they focused on was, the wording. A lot of places it was very specific to the United States. And so we were looking at this not just from making it US and Canada specific, but making it more global so that Mexico, Central America countries, and others who might want to pick up this document could take it and run with it. Even if they did their own version of it, they would have a nice starting point from which to go. So some of the things that this subgroup worked on, and I'll give you an example, a very easy one here is the directional domains. You have your 8 directionals in English. Well, in French, they have their versions of those. And so we would add those to our domain values. And the other thing that we did, looking at this from, okay, eventually Mexico, other countries are going to be there. How do we, every time we review this document, not continue to go through and have to keep adding more values in here? So we looked at the Civic Location Data Exchange Format Standard, and they had this nice little wording that you can see here on the screen that says, or equivalent words in other languages. And so we adopted that and put that in there. We also went through the document, and where appropriate, we would add the French Canadian examples. So example words that would have grave accents in there. So folks realize that, yes, you can use symbology with your letters in there. It doesn't break the standard at all. The work group also spent a long time in their subgroup looking at street name pre-type and post-type values. And one of the first things the group discussed is, well, why do we have them combine into one? Why don't we have a separate pre-type from post-type? And what we learned is that in French, they use more pre-types than they do post-type values. So while we may say main street and have street in the post-type, they would say rue principale and rue would be in the pre-type. And we quickly learned that we're going to have a lot of duplicates. So just leave it as one. We've since looked at that information. We took it as far as we could, made changes to this document, and the values that came up as far as new Canadian versions to be added that were French Canadian versions. We gave that to the CLDXF group, and they will do an additional review, and it will go off into the NINA pre-type and post-type registry at some point in the future. Another thing that we looked at as far as impacts from a country neutral text perspective was we've had this layer called mile markers, and it's a recommended layer. And in Canada, they don't use miles, they use the metric system. And so we looked at this layer and said, okay, we can change it to something different. We thought location would be a great name. But in our discussions of this is a little bit where we went off scope and out of our box, but we had a conversation about, well, we just talk about there being a numeric representation along some type of a linear feature. And that was actually extended in version 2 that it's now going to include additional location markers that are clearly signed. So sometimes they may not be a measured distance, but they do have some type of numbering system or definitive marking on them. And then lastly, the other thing that the Canadian group did is we looked at creating 2 appendices for national hydrology and railroad data sets that are used in Canada. The current version 1 had those for the US. We had the NHD, and then we had the Federal Railroad Administration's railroad data sets. And again, these are layers that are, if you have absolutely nothing, where could you potentially start? Okay, so another thing that we looked at was document structure. And one of the things that we wanted to do is make more common sense of it. When you go through version 1, it starts with your road center lines and site structure address points, and it continues on through kind of going from the required to the recommended layers. But we actually have themes. So for consistency, what we ended up doing is we grouped them by their category. So you can see here, this is actually our GIS data model layers are grouped by category. So we have roads, we have things related to the address points. I shouldn't say address points, to the addresses, because eventually there will be polygon versions of areas that can be addressed. And then your service boundaries and the provisioning boundaries. And then we have a thing called administrative units that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then railroads, hydrology, etc. So when we regrouped all of these, we looked at a couple different things. And for consistency, one of the things we wanted to do was to have a discussion at the beginning of every layer that laid out 3 common things. First of all, what was the type of feature that was being represented? And then, is this a point, a line, or a polygon type of feature? And then for consistency in NINA documents going forward, but more importantly for the mapping data service, is what should these layers be called? Now, the names that we came up with are names that will be used in the mapping data service when those layers are loaded. These are not required layer names that you need to use for your local data. You may continue to call them whatever you want locally. It's just when the MDS is going to be loaded, these are what the layer names in them are going to be. And so at the bottom of the screen there, you can see an example of the introductory text that we use, for example, railroads data. So you can see it's maintained as a line layer, what does it represent, and what it's referred to. And you'll notice that the name has the type of feature, also whether or not it's a point line or polygon, and it's all concatenated together. And that's how you will see it referenced throughout version 2 of the document. Okay, so from there, Deb, why don't you continue on and talk about that terminology about required, strongly recommended, and recommended layers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you saw in the table of contents, there are various items that are marked as well with required, strongly recommended, kind of what their structure is. But there's a section of the document that actually talks about, okay, which group of layers are the required, which are the strongly recommended, and which are recommended. We started looking at this because later on in this presentation, I'll talk about the provisioning boundary layer. But as we were looking at that, we were talking about how it falls in the category of required. And we looked at the definitions as they were in the document in that section 3, describing what it means to be required, strongly recommended, and recommended. And then it turned out in one of the conversations that we were having as a group, one person or a couple people were referencing language in the executive summary of the document, and the rest of us were looking at section 3, and we realized, okay, so we actually have it defined in 2 different areas and sort of in a way that conflicts, meaning that it wasn't entirely clear if required means that these layers are in fact to be provisioned to the ECRF and LVF, or that they may be provisioned. There was just inconsistency in what it meant to be a required layer, a strongly recommended layer, and just recommended. So we looked at that, and in the context of looking at all the layers, we decided that not only would we clarify the definitions and make it consistent between the 2 sections, but we also thought it would be a better and more understandable layout if we were to look at these in the form of a table instead of a bulleted list, and to give a little bit more context around the use of the layer in that way. And so in the document now, you'll see instead of just that bulleted list in section 3, things are laid out as a table. And I'm going to get to the layer names that you see in the second column in a minute. But mostly it's just, it's a different way of grouping and a way to lay out the information, hopefully in a more understandable way. And again, to provide more context about where these layers are being used. And the provisioning polygon is one that it is just a fun little guy that really prompted this whole venture outside of our charter. And again, I'll talk about it later, but these are the names that we came up with for those layers as well as part of our effort. As we were looking at this, one thing always triggers another, right? We're looking at one thing and we're having the discussion, and then we realize, well, hang on, wait, what are we actually calling these things? And one of our charter items also was to gain consistency in the way that layers are referenced and the names that should be used. And so it was something that began in our discussions last summer, that at the same time that we had a charter item to deal with what are these layer names actually meant to be called, there was work going on in the I3 architecture document work group to create an IANA registry of GIS data layer names. And so this is an interesting example of how different work groups have different things going on. And you always have at the beginning of every work group, like, is there duplication of effort or work or conflict or anything like that? And somehow, people are aware of it, they'll bring it up, and sometimes it comes out as a byproduct of the discussions that are going on in the work group. And so in this case, we realized, okay, we've talked about their categorization. Are they, recommended, strongly recommended, required? But let's look at their names. And then here's this IANA registry that is going to be coming out in the I3 document. But it was still at a point where the I3 document had a final public review to go through. And so as a data model work group, we had the opportunity to consult on and comment on that public review and say, okay, this is what you have built into this registry was originally taken from data model version 1. Now we're going through and making a few changes for consistency. all the things that Cheryl went through as far as country neutral text and all of these other concepts. So we need to look at these layer names and suggest some updates and replacements for what they had in there to start with. And there was actually a whole subgroup formed in the work group to go through that exercise and come up with layer names that would provide consistency, so that, you know, when you think about next gen and data that's being built, not just within your county, but from your county out to a region and a region out to a state, and eventually data that's built across the whole country, to support a true network of networks and an end-to-end considerations for a next gen deployment. You have to think about, okay, when you're providing that data, it would, not only is it good to have consistent fields and attribution and everything, but the actual layer names, if we could come up with one consistent name for everything, then it's very clear as you start to aggregate data up and up and up at those levels, which data flows into which layer and how to combine things. So we had an opportunity to look at that, and as we talked about too, just include the geometry as part of the layer name. So what we came up with is this table. The required is the road center line and site structure point, PSAT polygon. So including the geometry, or when in the case of tables, including table as part of the name. And we're going to get to, in the next slide, talking about these A1, A2, A3 polygons and the administrative units. Kind of flows into that concept of being country neutral. But we also did that because, as Cheryl mentioned, as NextGen evolves, we're going to get into different types of geometry for what you classically think of as a different type. Like address points is one thing, but there's a concept that eventually there will be address polygons as part of the structure. So you want to be able to allow for that growth and evolution of the standard in your naming structure, and start with a method that you can easily add in another geometry type if that is in fact what the standard is going to support. So these are the layer names to look at. Now, keep in mind that at the local level, as a GIS data provider, you're not required to suddenly say, but I just call my address point layer address points, or site structure points, or whatever you call it locally. That's fine. Keep calling it that. Call it, whatever you want locally, the same way that you can do with your schema and your fields. But you have to be able to look at the standard and treat it as a construct of transforming your data into that, so that whether that's something you're required to do before providing your data up to the SI provider, or whether that's something the SI provider handles. Like maybe the SI provider says, okay, just tell me in the local data that you provided, what's your road center line and what's your site structure point, and then they'll do that mapping. But you just have to think of it from the concept of what you do locally gets transformed, ETL'd into the format and structure that's needed for NextGen, and being able to support that. So Cheryl's going to talk a little bit more about administrative units.
Yeah, so the administrative units was a really interesting conversation in the work group, and it was two very distinct sides of the aisle. And it started because in Canada, they don't have states. They don't have counties. They have different types of administrative units that they use. And the fields that we were using were all English, US-based names, even though that we had our section names in the document that said or equivalents. We weren't doing that down into the individual field names, and they were indicating that, we're used to using the international standards of the A1, A2, A3, A4, A5 to represent these. Can we consider doing this? So we had many discussions about this within the large work group about how we potentially do that. And the one thing to note, though, these A1 to A5 names, they are aligned with PIDFlow. PIDFlow uses these names. So this isn't a whole new construct in NG9-1-1. There is already naming conventions that are out there already. And the fact that Canada could then easily take these A1 to A5 and map their provinces, their territories, their indigenous lands, and even their military installations that fall into these categories was going to be much more helpful. And then looking at the bigger focus on going to country neutral, This would also allow Canada, the Central America countries, and others to be able to use these same names. And of course, like I said, there's two different sides of the aisles and different thoughts on this. So we do everything in NINA work groups by consensus. So after many long discussions about this, it was decided, yes, we were going to move forward with this naming nomenclature in version 2. The other thing to note is these A1 through A5s, they were originally created by the IETF, which is an international standards organization. So again, this is not something we're making up. We have precedents before us. There were some comments that were submitted about this, and the work group is going to be looking at these in the future. But we will right now just let folks know that's the reasoning why we are making these recommended changes at this point in time. The other topic that was quite a big discussion was the NINA Globally Unique ID. And this whole discussion wasn't originally on our charter, but there was the intent to better clarify what agency ID was and to define it and describe it in a little bit better detail. Now, in the beginning of version 1 and version 2, there's a whole section about the NINA Globally Unique ID. And so as we were talking about doing that, the folks that are on the NINA work group that are also on the NINA I3 work group, who has just completed their version 3, were saying, hey, we standardized how we're going to be doing our unique IDs. And we use this thing called a URN that's on the very beginning of their IDs. And they're like, why can't we make a GIS URN value for it? And so they asked the work group to consider doing that. Another thing that came up in our discussion is, okay, we have something that's out there people are already using, so we need to minimize how we change things. And so if you actually already have these NINA Global Unique IDs out there where you have your local unique ID and your agency ID, those pieces are not changing. And when Deb and I were trying to figure out how do we explain what the differences are, it was kind of hard to do it, but we have the differences here shown in red. And so if you have your local unique ID and your agency ID, the one thing that's different is you're going to have to go through and replace your @ symbol with a colon. Anything in front of that is all new that you can just bolt on, and it's not going to change. It's going to be the same within each layer. Now you'll notice there's a thing here called layer indicator. And in version 1, this was an optional recommended type of information to put on the front of your global unique ID, part of your local ID. And it would be, is this a road center line? So you might use RCL. Is this a PSAP layer? You might put PSAP. But there was no standard on what that layer indicator could be. So in version 2, we said, you know what, let's make it a requirement and just tell folks you have to use it. And as Deb mentioned, there is that IANA registry that was set up for GIS layer names. In our version of the document in version 2, we actually have a section in there that will instruct IANA to add a column to that GIS layers registry that will provide what those values should be for the layers. And that's based upon a subgroup got together, they went through, they looked at all the GIS layers that are listed there, and they came up with a recommendation that the work group approved and is currently in the document. And then that piece that is in front of it, that URN value, is going to be the same for every GIS layer, whether it's roads, address points, or surface boundary, hydrography. It's always going to be that URN emergency UID GIS. So if you have things that are already set up this way, again, it should be a very simple change, but there is going to be new information on the front of it that you may have to get used to putting on. And again, you don't have to carry this in your local data set. If you want to do an ETL or your SI provider wants to do the ETL, they can lump that information on the front, your URN and your layer indicator for you. Because again, that will be the same in every single layer that's there. Let's see. So then let's talk a little bit about what actually changed regarding the NINA Global Unique ID in the document. Well, the first thing that the work group discussed is every layer had this little prefix on the front of it. So if you were in the road center lines, your field name was RCL and GLID, and SSAP and on and on. And the thought was, Well, a global unique ID is a global unique ID is a global unique ID in every layer. Why are we calling it something different? It doesn't mean anything different. And so the change that we made is within every layer, the field name is now just NGUID. And it's in all layers where it's considered a primary key. Now, we didn't change it when it was operating as a foreign key. And what a foreign key is in your related tables, that's kind of your cross-reference between that current table and the primary key that's in another table. And so there's only a few of them. There's one for road center lines in order to be able to relate to the alias street names. And then there's also the site structure one where you have the site global unique ID. And those are actually in the landmark name parts and the landmark name, the complete landmark name tables. Now, if you've been following what's been going on with CLDXF version 2, that's been out for a public review already, they are actually removing the whole landmark names and landmark name parts, and they're adding some additional fields for which those values will be put in instead. So in NENA Global Unique IDs, while this is changing for what we're calling them there, the section in our document for data model that talks about landmark names and landmark name parts, don't get hung up on it, because those sections will go away in a future version of the data model. We're just waiting for work to be finished in those other groups before we can tackle them.
Yeah,
So
so
I think, go ahead, Deb.
yeah, just going to add in, I think one thing that was interesting in this conversation when we were talking about, well, there are many interesting things. It was people get very passionate about unique IDs. And so we had a lot of good discussion about it, but I think this also helps to clarify any lingering confusion over, it was in the first data model, it was stated that it was mandatory to use this structure, but then it was recommended to use a part of the structure, which was that layer indicator, that RCL or SSAP or that prefix. So I think it unintentionally put out some confusion about, okay, is it just that part that's optional? Is the whole structure optional? It sounds like it was just this weird gray area of what is mandatory versus what is recommended, and just got things a little confusing. So this clarifies that not only are that layer indicator is in fact mandatory, the entire structure of the ID is mandatory, and that's what needs to be followed in the population. So hopefully that eliminates some of the confusion, although it's still, this is still a tricky one that people will want to talk through, just depending on the level of maintenance that goes on in their own local data sets, and if that's something I've already incorporated or need to for the first time. So anything else you were going to say on?
Nope, I was just going to say, why don't you go ahead and move forward in our next topic.
All right. So we'll talk about spatial reference. So this was also interesting. So it was brought up that, yeah, at one point in the recent past, there was discussion about new datums that were being discussed with NOAA, and a whole datum shift that was supposed to happen in 2022. And hey, is this a good time to look at shifting, these new datums or other datums so that we can think about WGS 84 and maybe using something that's more current and more accurate? Because WGS 84 is, there's something like 7 or 8 different versions of it, and we're using the first and most original one and none of the later ones. And when you start getting down into the accuracy of it, there's just some question about, is there a better spatial reference that could be used? And that kind of the conversation got a little bit sidelined when those datums were shifted to something like 2025 or beyond now. It's ever changing, I think, but also because those are really centered on North America. They're not necessarily, a true global spatial reference. And so just the whole conversation was brought up as a means of saying, is there something we could use that would be better? Let's think about it. Let's talk about it. And in that conversation, we also realized, so this IETF that we've talked about before is really the basis of all of these standards. IETF is what the I3 architecture references. and then what, as a result, the data model references as far as what standards, what spatial reference. And so right now it is a mandate to use WGS 84. It's mandated by the IETF. And so that's not to say we couldn't change it in the future by having a well thought out proposal and going to IETF to say, for these reasons, we think there's a newer or more accurate spatial reference that we would advocate for. But at least for right now, we put a pause on the discussion just based on some of the shifting conversations. So that's where that stood. But in the review of the section, we also were looking at the horizontal accuracy, and we started digging into that one. And it was another interesting thing where a lot of different people went on a deep dive hunt for where did that there was something like a plus or minus 13.89 feet that was referenced in horizontal accuracy. And we were trying to figure out where did that actually come from. And it came to be understood that it actually came from a map display standard. So not a standard that really had to do with like attribute accuracy or anything else that needed to specifically affect call routing, but rather it was for map display. And when you're routing a call, there isn't a visual map that's routing the call. It's all handled by machines on the back end. So we decided that whole the conversation around data accuracy, it didn't need to be, certainly not the map for map display. It didn't need to be in the standard. And it's really a conversation that's more about how you build and maintain your data as opposed to what the standard requires. So that was shifted or looking to move that over to the stewardship conversation. And in case you guys aren't aware, I know we talked about the various work groups when the data model version 1 was being drafted and discussed for those 8 years. There weren't any work groups that dealt with stewardship of the data. The data model sort of adopted this. It's the standard, but language snuck in that also gave some direction or guidance on how to build it or how to maintain it, or just more of the how-tos as opposed to just the strict structure that needed to be followed. And then towards the very end, right before version 1 was published, is when the stewardship, GIS data stewardship work group was really getting started. And they were initially looking at just the PSAP boundary layer creation and maintenance. So as that group has grown and now added in considerations for service boundaries and for road center lines, we're really able to look at lingering language in the data model and start to migrate that out of the standard and into stewardship where it belongs, because it's not something that really needs to be mandated in a standard. It's in a lot of ways a local decision, and you just need to be able to, again, transform it into the structure that the standard requires. So that's where we landed on that one. And then we got to the very fun topic of service boundaries. This is an inadvertent sort of hot button issue as well that we came across. And we started talking about it. I think, I don't remember what exactly prompted it, but I know that as part of it, we were looking at comparisons to Appendix B in the I3 standard. And that's really meant to be the core of what formed the data model standard. And we were looking at Appendix B and we were having these different conversations, and we realized that, the word emergency for emergency service boundaries, that's really in I3, everything is a service boundary. So service boundaries, like a PSAP boundary is a service boundary, a fire boundary is a service boundary, a police boundary, et cetera, et cetera. These are all service boundaries. So let's call everything a service boundary, but still provide the description of what the key really required service boundaries are, like PSAP and fire and EMS and police. It really just focuses in on the fact that while all the structure is identical for all service boundaries from PSAP down to poison control, if you don't have a PSAP boundary, you can't route a call. Like that's the first and foremost layer that you need is a PSAP boundary, but we don't need to have in the standard this over repetition from one section to the next of the exact same structure. We can combine it into one section for service boundaries and still call out its use and purpose and importance as a required layer. So that's how we handled that was number one, to eliminate the word emergency from the title of, instead of ESBs, they're just SBs. We looked at removing language about having to separate them into individual police, fire, and EMS. And that's because, again, that lingering stewardship language was in the standard, saying that it absolutely was a requirement that you had to separate out these layers before providing them to your SI provider and then on into the system. This sparked so much debate that we ended up raising it at a joint committee meeting. Nina has these joint committee meetings every fall that really brings in all of the different active work groups and any issues that range across work groups and may have implications across several, and just needs more input and discussion as opposed to just one work group making a decision kind of in a vacuum. So it came up to JCM where we had the conversation and said, okay, is there any functional reason why these layers in fact have to be separated out, or can they be kept combined and maintained and provided as a combined layer? And the outcome of that was there isn't a functional reason why they have to be separate. Many people find it easier to keep them separate for their own maintenance practices. That's fine. If you find it easier to keep it together in a combined layer, that's fine too. So we just wanted to eliminate the language that said you absolutely had to separate them out in case there were agencies that find it easier to provide as a combined layer. And then, as I mentioned, the subsections now in the service boundary area call out specifically that there's primary PSAP services, which is that PSAP polygon layer or classic PSAP boundary layer. And then primary emergency services, we did sustain the use of emergency there just to give a better context around which three layers we're talking about here, the fire, EMS, and police. And then other services which are strongly recommended, like Coast Guard, Polygon, Poison Control, because these are the layers that allow for you to search out and transfer calls to different agencies. Now, of course, you'd also have to have a poison control agency that is able to accept, a SIP call and in NG format, and then accept it in their center and process the call. But the point is that no matter which service you are trying to create a boundary for geographically, they all follow the same structure and are all, in a sense, service boundaries. So that's where that discussion came about. Now we get to provisioning, and this was the guy that kicked off that whole required, strongly recommended, and recommended discussion. And it was because the provisioning boundary is a fun layer that exists nowhere except in this standard. So it doesn't exist in I3. It doesn't exist in the ECRF and LVF GIS provisioning standard. It doesn't exist in a lot of places where you'd think a layer of this importance as a required layer should maybe have some background or understanding or basis. And in the language of version 1, it was a little bit confusing over, is this just a layer that's used to assemble GIS data, or is it a layer that actually does get provisioned into these functional elements and possibly even has a grander purpose in the network of network structure and the forest guide solution for determining where all your ECRFs are and how they relate to one another. So it really, it was causing some heartburn. And in the discussion, the decision that we came to was, while it is not a layer that gets provisioned to ECRF and LVF, it is a critical layer for determining how your data is getting stitched together from the county level to the region level to the state level. Again, these are a next-gen system is generally not a single county at a time, standing up an EZNet and all of the functional elements and going live with next-gen. You're thinking about your data that's being provided out to larger and larger groups for aggregation and overall regional or statewide deployments. So you need to know how that data comes together. Every county is great about maintaining your data for your own systems and your centers, but pretty much every data set also has some segments and points that venture outside because maybe it's part of their service area or something that they need for one system or another. You want to have data that goes outside your borders just a little bit. But when you're looking at it from a regional or a state perspective, you don't want it to come from all of these different counties with all of these different surrounding features. And then you end up with a whole lot of duplication around your borders. And in some cases, data that would conflict and cause an issue when you're trying to validate a location and then route a call. So the provisioning boundary kind of gives you those fence lines, those borders that says, okay, this county submits data and is responsible for data and the resolution of errors only within this county boundary. Or maybe you've got a region where there's one GIS data provider for a 4-county region. In that case, you would have all of the data as a regional data set submitted, and your provisioning polygon would be the regional polygon, not the individual counties. So that's what we did. And it also prompted us to refer some work over to the I3 architecture work group to say, you know, there was this language that referred to the forest guide and referred to its use in ECRFs. So there may be something there that needs to be determined. There's some other concepts in I3 around coverage regions. Like if that's if that needs to be defined as a GIS layer, then I3 needs to sort that out and then get it included in Appendix B and get the information to us as far as what the structure, you know, needs to look like in order for that to work effectively in the system. So it was another fun conversation. They generally are. Like we've said before, you never know what's going to be an easy conversation and what's going to spark some passionate debate. But it's good.
Passionate.
Yeah, passionate. That's the word I'm going with.
All right.
So where are we now?
Yeah. So where are we now? So our work ended on in June, and we had an all committee review that finished on July 23rd, where people were allowed within the NINA development group to submit comments on the document. We received 34 comments. Starting tomorrow, the work group is getting back together, and we will, over the next hopefully month or two, go through all 34 comments. We will discuss them, we will adjudicate them, and come to a decision as to does the document need to be modified in any way or not. And then those will, the document will then go out for a public review, and we expect that to happen this fall. And as public review, anyone can make comments on the document. So when it goes out, we recommend that it be socialized, that people share it, and if you have concerns or comments on it, to go ahead and submit them. And then when you look beyond that, what happens after version 2? The thing to remember is we talked about those 3 pages of future work that were in version 1 of the document. Well, we removed some of that in version 2, but guess what? We added more. And in addition, there are other NINA work groups out there, like the Data Transition Work Group, the CLDXF Work Group, Canada's CLDXF Work Group, that have come up with some other things that will impact the data model. There's even some, a 3D GIS work group has got a document out right now that's for review. There's probably things in there that will impact the data model. So we're going to go back and look at that 6-phase plan and say, okay, we have what was identified for what's next that we should work on. However, let's take a look at all these other things, put those into the mix. Do we need to realign and reprioritize stuff and maybe create smaller chunks of things to do? And so Deb, myself, and our other co-chairs and our committee group co-chairs are going to sit down and figure out a proposed plan that we will then present to the larger NDG work group at the November Joint Committee meeting. And once we get there, we will have a plan that will lay out, okay, we've revised the plan. What does it look like next for version 3? And then after version 2 is done, we will move forward with version 3. And that's what will happen with every version, is there's always things happening. Standards are dynamic. And so we will bring them in. We will look and see what's really a higher priority at that time and adjust accordingly. And so that's basically where we are. Hey, Carrie, what do we got? I saw that there was quite a lot of stuff going on in the chat box.
Okay, so surprise, Carrie had to drop off, and I was asked to fill in. Happy to do so.
Hey,
both
Matt.
as a member
Hey, Matt.
of both as a member of URISA's Next Generation 911 Task Force, but also as a part of this NINA work group, which Cheryl and Deb. It's been great having you lead this work group and navigate all of the rocks and shoals that come up in discussing some of these things. So there are quite a few questions. I believe some of the questions you did a great job of answering, not knowing that you did so. And so I will ask before we tackle some of the other questions. Pete, I think they address your questions. If you don't think that they did, if you wouldn't mind putting something back in chat and we can cycle back to that, I'd appreciate that. So one of the questions that we had, and I'm going to bounce around and try to have a logical flow here as best we can. Is there a field with the fully concatenated street name? And if not, why not?
Hasn't been
It doesn't.
recommended.
Yeah, well, and it's really, the machines don't need it to route the call. A map display might need it at the end in the PSAP as far as producing a good label, but a concatenated field is more prone to cause confusion when you're trying to match up elements of an address for validation. That's why it's all parsed out. But a combined field can be useful to a PSAP or CAD mapping display. But this is for next gen as with the primary focus of routing the call. Possibly something we didn't talk too much really at all today about is in I3, there's an element called the map display service, mapping data service now. That has this idea of kind of building a nationwide public safety grade data map display, where something like that may come up later on, but that's some of those considerations for future work that it may end up in the future if that's our directive, is to think about it for that purpose and maybe have a field that's more for labeling than machine to machine validation and call routing.
And there's nothing preventing you from carrying it locally too. You can carry
Exactly.
whatever you need locally.
Yep.
So that's a great answer. I think that answer also answers our next question, which was, is this intended to provide a fully routable street network? I think
Right
the
now,
answer there.
Yeah, it's more about routing
Go
a
ahead.
call than routing a vehicle. That's always, when you say routing, people's minds, if you're used to supporting PSAP and CAD mapping, you're going to go right to the vehicle and think about turns and routes and from to elevation and overpasses, underpasses. But for next gen, it's about routing a call, not a vehicle. But again, that mapping data service may circle around back to us and try and introduce some other requirements into it. But so far, the connectivity and the vehicle routability is not a primary consideration of the data set.
There are fields in there like one way and
Yep.
Speed limit that can help with that, but they are optional fields. They are not required to be populated.
Exactly.
All right. Another question, is the forest guide a protocol for aggregating local NG9-1-1 GIS data at the national level? Why is it called the forest guide?
It's called the forest guide because it looks like a tree. It's
Yeah.
There's actually a NENA document about the forest guide, but it's intended to help the system understand that at the top level, what are the other, I'm going to screw this up, Deb.
Well, the way I always describe it is like to help with the call transfers and to describe the network of networks. Like
Right.
one state stands up an EZNet, the neighboring state stands up an EZNet, but the two have to be able to talk to each other and transfer between them. So those are like two branches on a tree. and they
have feeders from below them.
Yep.
So a state might have regions that report to them, or smaller states might have individual counties that report to them.
But in order to make it it happens all too often today where a call through one way or another gets completely misrouted, maybe like because VoIP phones require the user to update their own address. Calls get placed and somebody has moved across the country, brought their VoIP phone with them, haven't updated their address location. And so calls can go to, an old center for their new address states away because that's where it still shows that they're located. And so you can't just transfer a call from Colorado to Michigan. It's just the infrastructure, the architecture is not there. But as next gen evolves and all these networks are built and connect, that will be possible. But then you need a roadmap for within that network, and that's the forest guide. So it's just likened to a tree instead of a roadmap for those connections.
All right, that's a great explanation of this very theoretical concept, which is going to make all this stuff work, especially because we're seeing multiple spatial interface providers, multiple LESINet providers in the United States, and we know globally, you know, that we're going to wind up being quite a few. There needs to be something to organize those trees, so to speak. Speaking of organizing trees, why is the design still using only 10-character cryptic field names?
Gotcha.
Okay, I'll take this one because I co-chair another work group with a person in Alaska. We have to remember that not everybody is as far along in building their GIS data as other folks are, nor do they have the resources to buy very expensive software that have all the bells and whistles. And so we have to remember too, we also started Data Model, is it 10 years ago now, Deb, 11? I can't remember how many years it is. But anyways,
Yeah.
a long time ago, when they started the Data Model, long time ago, people did not have as advanced systems, and some of them still don't. There are places in Alaska that don't even have road centerline files yet. And so they are still using software that deals with shape files and are not even at the geodatabase design, which, you know, a lot of folks are using the Esri software, but not everyone is advanced. So we have to make something that is still usable. And this is just within the US. This is not even going out into countries that are further behind than us at this point in time. And we don't know exactly where they are. So unfortunately, right now, when we had to come up with field names, we stuck with the limitation that's in the shapefile format so that it's all inclusive and we don't exclude anyone unintentionally. At some point in the future, could that change? Possibly, but I don't want to even predict when or if.
All right, excellent. So we're 2 minutes over, but we have a question that's near and dear to my heart, so we'll end with this question. One of the great things I find in the data model is how it has the structure for left side parity, right side parity, and has the coded values for parity, odd, even, both, and Z for 0, address ranges. So the question is the arrowhead of the street segment always pointing towards the direction of increasing address numbers? Did we address that in this version 2 of the data model so far?
That's a stewardship issue. And in the stewardship document, which will hopefully be going out for a NINA internal review in a couple weeks, you will see that the guidance is your from addresses should be lower than your to addresses as a guideline. Are they required? No. And then you will also have the issues where you have somebody who let a builder go ahead and number the houses, and they started on the left and they went, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 can go around the circle, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 back to the bottom. So you're going to have directionality that is opposite on either side. And they also have both odd and evens on the side. It just exists. We know that that's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
right.
one other thing I'll add to that, though, I recently went down this little rabbit hole trying to determine kind of where parity actually comes in with the validation and call routing. And it really helps determine when you're validating on center lines and there's any sort of offset involved in geocoding and determining a location, right? When you geocode from a center line, there may be like a 5-10 foot something offsite on a particular side of the segment indicated by the parity. You know, it's a combination of validating the location and then determining if it's on the left side, the right side, or if it's a number that could be on either side. You know, where do you place that point? Where do you offset it? So that's another way that it can come into play in the overall next gen architecture.
All right, excellent. So thank you all for the questions and answering the questions, and thank you also Cheryl and Deb for this wonderful presentation. I personally think you did a great job of explaining that NINA is kind of like an octopus. There are a lot of arms. They're all doing different things. They sometimes relate and get tied up. And sometimes we think a group should be able to address or resolve something, but there might be another group that's better suited or better to be tasked with to address that and create the path forward. So I believe that's one of the really great things to come out of this of your presentation for folks that may not be familiar with that. As a lot of the discussion entailed, a lot of what is dealt with, there may not be one perfect way to do it. And so a lot of the discussion reaching consensus is working through the different options and trying to recommend a way forward if you're interested in these issues. As they noted, their public review of the document will be coming up. You can also join NENA work groups without being a member of NENA. And also, URISA is having their LEAP conference, looking at location and enterprise addressing and public safety. That's being planned for early next year, February, I believe. That does deal with a lot of these different issues. When we're talking about a data model, we're talking about next generation 911. We can't always create use those great rules and business practices to create a clean reality. We always have a messy reality, and we're always trying to apply these business rules and data models to it. And so that's one of the organizing frames from that conference is a deeper discussion on a lot of these issues that it tends to keep us working, tends to keep us thinking about things and digging into the issues. So please reach out to NENA or look at NENA's resources if you'd like to get involved. Please reach out to URISA if you'd like to get involved. And please continue asking questions, sending in comments, attending webinars, and being part of the next generation 911 GIS community. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.